Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you from whichever part of the world you're joining us. My name is Praveen. I lead marketing at BrowserStack, and in my previous incarnation, I was also a product manager. I led the product team for Automate, our Selenium testing product. I am really excited to host this webinar. Happy to see such a great turnout. We've got more and more attendees joining as we speak. Thank you all for attending from all the different parts of the world. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping pointers. We are recording this webinar and we will be sharing the link with all of you post the webinar in the next couple of days. We'll also be putting it up on our YouTube channel so you guys can go through this webinar at your own leisure. In terms of questions, there is a Q&A option button in the Zoom interface. You can feel free to use that throughout the webinar and ask your questions. We will reserve about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to take questions. So I will go through all the questions that you folks have asked, and where possible, hopefully, I will answer, or Todd and Vikas can answer. So let me just, before we start and I introduce you to our main presenters, I'll just talk a little bit about BrowserStack. So we're a company that was started about 8 years ago, and our co-founders Ritesh and Nakul worked out of a coffee shop to solve one problem, right? They were basically developing websites, and they were using Macs, and they couldn't find a way to test their website on IE, and that one problem is what led them to start BrowserStack. So working out of a coffee shop, this is the first version, right? We launched with BrowserStack, allowing developers around the world to test their websites on Internet Explorer. Within 6 months, we had 1,000 customers, and now 8 years later, we have 3 offices, 300 plus employees, and 25,000 plus customers. Our customers include sort of the leading players from all the different verticals that you can think of: finance, technology, media, government, education, fashion, and retail. If you look at some of the open source technologies that use BrowserStack, right, over 1,800 open source projects actually test their projects on the BrowserStack platform. We've got some of the leading open source frameworks and tools using BrowserStack to test. So jQuery, Angular, Discourse, Meteor, even Mozilla use BrowserStack. So we're really excited to support all of these open source projects. Some of the world's largest cloud providers actually rely on BrowserStack to test their platform. So we've got Amazon, Google, Oracle, and Microsoft who also use BrowserStack to test their software. Let me talk a little bit about our scale. So we have 2 million registered users on our platform. We have approximately 72 billion Selenium commands that run on our platform every year. We have 135 countries where we have customers, and we have 10 data centers spread across the world. We're launching more soon as we speak. All of these data centers provide real mobile devices. So we have all the different iOS and Android devices, plus real desktop browsers. So, all of the key desktop browsers that we have going back many versions. Overall, our coverage is around 2,000 plus browsers and devices, all of them real browsers and real devices on real environments. Let me talk a little bit about our products. So we have 4 main products. The product that Todd and Vikas are going to be talking about today is Automate, and how they use Automate at the Weather Channel. Automate is basically our Selenium grid on the cloud, and you can use Automate to basically scale your testing and scale across 2,000 plus browsers and devices. Live is the leading cross-browser testing tool, which allows QAs to perform interactive web-based testing. So when you need to test out something manually, you can use Live to test on a real mobile device or browser. We have App Automate, which allows users to test their mobile apps basically at scale on the real devices that we have on our platform. With App Automate, you can integrate using Appium, Espresso, XUI Test, and Earl Grey. And the last product we have is App Live, which is the same as Live, except you can now do interactive testing for your native and hybrid mobile apps on real mobile devices. Now I'd like to sort of move on and introduce you to our 2 main speakers. We have Todd Eaton and Vikas. Just going to go back to the first slide here and just talk a little bit about them. So Todd heads consumer products and web operations at the weather company, primarily weather.com, and Vikas is the leader in SDET web and mobile apps at Xpanxion LLC. Todd and Vikas, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Praveen. Really appreciate it. All right, let me bring up our presentation. So, hold on a second. Let me get out of that and let me go to the first one. We were practicing a little bit beforehand, so we'll get into that. So, my name is Todd Eaton, and I'm here with Vikas Thange. We're with IBM, and we do deal with weather.com and wonderground.com. To kind of give you a little bit, I'm a head of web operations and DevOps for the IBM Watson Media and Weather consumer products. So with that, that group encompasses the QA and DevOps teams for weather.com and www.wonderground.com. Interesting thing, when you showed that slide and you were talking about the customers, Wonderground was not originally part of us. We actually purchased Wonderground back, I think around 2012, something like that, 2013, and they were a customer of BrowserStack at that time. So quite a long way. We have quite a bit of history with this. Vikas, you want to talk about a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Todd. Hi, this is Vikas, and I'm working as a lead estate at Xpanxion. I do have expertise into automation testing with framework development into CI/CD environment, and I have been working with Todd from the last 6.5 years. So Xpanxion has many clients. IBM Weather Channel is one of them, and yeah, it's nice to be here.
Yeah, great. All right, we're going to go over the agenda, but before I start with the agenda, I do want to get to preface one thing. I just took my business conduct guidelines for IBM, and IBM wanted to remind me that IBM does not endorse any products or any process whatsoever. So I don't want to let anybody to believe that this is a formal endorsement. We rely on everyone to choose their own. That's a big thing with IBM. We are big users of open source and of using our own tools. So they give us a lot of leeway in how we select what we use. And this presentation, we're going to talk about how we do it for weather.com and wonderground.com. So a little bit on what we're doing. We're going to talk about release goals. We're going to kind of talk about where we came from and how we wanted to change, because you'll see from it we needed to do something different as we for our releases. We're going to go overview of our testing and release process. I'll talk about that. How do we test? How do we release any features and functions, things like that. And a lot of that may be familiar with you if you're an Agile shop. Then we're going to take a deep dive of our release process. We're going to talk about our merges. We'll talk about testing and how we do our tests. We'll talk about results and what we do with the results. And then we'll talk about deployments. And then lastly, we'll talk about conclusions and kind of the things that we learned from our release process and as we went through this journey. So to start out, let's talk about release goals. Our release history is probably very familiar to some of you. We had large and infrequent releases. I was talking to the head of development in our group before this call or before this meeting, and we were reminiscing about back in 2012 when we were weather.com. We were a Java app and on like 200 web servers and just doing these monolithic releases like once every couple of weeks. And that's when I first came in, and it was a nightmare. You start out at 4 a.m. and you're trying to do these releases, and then you have to go verify everything, and you don't know where to verify it. We got it down as we progressed, when I started and we were starting to implement some more process in it, we still were only releasing 3 to 4 times a week. And in that, a lot of things, what we were finding is it was like 6.5, 7 features or fixes per release when you look at the stats. that's a little misleading because we were doing some releases just had one item in it. So we may do a couple of releases in a week for like a CDN update or a database update or something like that. It was just one thing. And then you got this big monolithic release that's got like 20. And there you're just, you're back into that soup again where you have these large releases. This chart kind of shows where we were at in 2015 and 2016. This is kind of the crux of, we got off of that big Java app and we started going to, we were at a Drupal PHP app at that time. You see in 2015, we did 162 releases and we rolled out about 1,341 features or fixes that came out. 2016 got a little bit better, did 192 releases. Well, when you look at that over 50 weeks, right, we got a couple of change freeze weeks, if we couldn't do anything, you're still averaging 3.5, something like that, releases per week. So not really the volume that we were after. In addition to that, we had an unacceptable number of failures. These monolithic releases or these huge releases, they come up with these interdependencies. We had all these different features for different components, all trying to be crammed into the same release. And it experienced when, fortunately for us, you know, it wasn't always exposed in a pre-prod or a stage environment. Some of our issues that we had were more involved in, like, they would be showing up in production where we had volume that would cause these failures to come out, and it was really just an untenable position. What we found out was we didn't have enough test coverage to catch all these failures. Volume was an issue, not just volume, but also these interdependencies, and we didn't check it on all the browsers and all the devices and everything that was out there. In this chart, you'll see that we had our failure list, and in 2015, we had about 21% failure rate. In 2016, it was down to 16%, but when you got 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 failures, yeah, it's just ridiculous. You can't really do anything about that. So we had some goals. Of course, our first goal, we need to reduce our release failures. We set a goal of less than 5%. That's the guy that we really wanted to get to. When in 2016, we said, let's give us a mark and we'll try to hit that mark as we go. In addition, what we saw was to reduce the failures, we had to reduce the complexity of the releases. And we'd reduce the size of the releases to only a couple of features per release. That's what more that we were after. We didn't want those 20 or 18 to 20 items in a release or components. Another thing is we needed to increase our test coverage, and we needed to cover the top browsers or devices that our users were using. This was an important piece because, as we'll talk about before, we were kind of missing the mark until we worked with our analytics group to kind of figure out where we were going with this. And then the last one is, and this was a stretch goal for us, we wanted to increase the number of releases so we could do multiples per day. We were in a place where developers were trying to get things in the release all the time. When we say, okay, we're planning for a release on this day, everybody tried to cram whatever they could into that release because they were afraid the next one would be after a business deadline or after a revenue mark. So we kind of analogize it, yeah, like I can talk, to like a train, right? Where you got a train that pulls into the station and then you get on the train and then the train leaves. Well, in some of that situation, some of the trains would go in and they would leave the station and not come back again for another week. And that was not acceptable for a lot of our management. So we needed to increase the number of releases to multiple times a day. All right, let's talk about a little bit of the testing and release process that we got now. So we had an agile coach that was here that was big in Spotify. He kind of latched onto the Spotify agile approach where you have squads and you're using Kanban, and we really jumped in on that. So when you look at it, we have a squad, and the squad is made up of a couple of developers, maybe a front end, a back end, a product owner, a part-time designer, and then a QA person. And the developer completes the code, and they'll make a PR, and then they'll put it out there. The testers will test that. They'll be writing test cases while they do this, and then they'll test out the PR. They do some other tests, and this is an important part as well, because it's not just functional that we have to worry about. We have things like accessibility and performance and security and those types of things, and the testers in the squads are the first ones to crack that. Senior dev conducts a code review and then marks a PR approved, and then the tester puts a label in GitHub that says a QA approved. That's the key, because what we did was we have a release boss that reviews eligible PRs and then merges them, and that's where we get the merge in the pipeline. So the merge happens, the release boss initiates the merges, selects which services are needed, and proceeds with pushing out and doing the linting, the unit tests, the building of the services, Dockerizing, all those types of things that we have with a Docker Kubernetes app, which is what we are now. After that, the release boss deploys to a test or a pre-prod environment, and then we initiate tests. We have tests that are scheduled overnight, they continue to run, but then we also have ones that we can call off in the pipeline or outside of the pipeline, so then we can get these, do the tests against it and get our results back, so we can do our releases during the day or do the releases first thing in the morning. Overnight, it also does a performance test, it does a full regression. Daytime, we do a visual regression piece, and then we do a partial regression, and Vikas will talk about that later on. Lastly, we do the deployment, and the release boss is still involved in that. They initiate a change request. We have a formal change process here, change request process, that they go through and they submit it out. It notifies the stakeholders, hey, we're doing a release. The release boss talks to DevOps. DevOps says, yep, go ahead, give us a call if anything fails. And then they proceed with the release. And after they're done, they initiate the release complete and either notify of success or a failure of the release. So very similar, if you're in an Agile environment, this is not anything new. If you're not in an Agile environment, this is kind of the next step. You have a lot of waterfall and these huge releases. This is actually a quicker way of doing it and something that we adapted to pretty well. All right, so now we're gonna go, but looking at that, we want to deep dive a little bit, because the reason why you're on this webinar is you want to actually see some of this stuff, which makes total sense. So we'll talk about a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about the goals and how they relate, and then we'll talk about the tools and the processes that we use to kind of get that. So the first thing is the merges. Our goal was to reduce the size of the releases to 2 to 3 features per release. With that, to accomplish that goal, we had to have better control of our releases and actually put some guardrails around it. Our first step was we introduced the role of the release boss. Now for us, the release boss is actually a role that's split among multiple people. It's split upon 5 people right now. And people are responsible for 1 day a week. So they have their schedule. They say, hey, Sarala, you got Monday. Sarala will go out and she'll function as the release boss. She won't do very much testing within the squad during that day, because her main role is to work with the various groups and make sure the releases are going out on time. Only the release boss, DevOps, and dev leads are able to merge. That's an important piece to this, because with that, we want to make sure we keep control of who is doing the merges and that we have the right things out there and able to test them. The release boss will manage the amount, because there's going to be times where we may need something more than 2 to 3. We just had our CCPA initiative come out. People that don't know CCPA, that's it's an American GDPR. It's a California Consumer Protection Act, and we had to put things on our site to accommodate that. In those, we actually had to do a few more features per release, but we were okay with that because the release boss would keep control and understand what services that he had to go out for them. All right, so the testing, what we looked at was a goal to increase the test coverage and cover top browsers and devices. On that piece of it, to accomplish that goal, we had to increase our tests and we had to increase what devices or browsers we did it on. And we had to do it in a way that we could get better throughput. So the first thing that we did was we introduced a hybrid framework to increase the test coverage and the number of cases that we had. We added test execution jobs in Jenkins to make it easier to run the tests. So then we didn't have to call in a special group. The people that were dealing with either the squad testing or the release boss could just execute right in Jenkins. We also worked with our analytics team to determine the top browsers and devices. So make sure that we were hitting the right ones and that we got the right coverage that we were looking for. So our hybrid framework was created by with the help with Vikas and some other folks. So I want Vikas to kind of explain what we talked about with the hybrid framework.
Thanks, Todd. So as we know, for every successful automation testing project, one of the key ingredient is the successful automation framework. So with last 6.5 years, we developed many frameworks. We scrapped it again and we developed again from scratch. And this is the final outcome of all our efforts that we worked for years. So this is the current framework. We have been using it from last 3 years, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yep. And we have put a lot of efforts to make it stable, make it successful. And now this framework is one of the benchmark that we have set in IT industry for automation testing. So just to give a high level idea, when we say hybrid framework, it's basically a data-driven plus keyword-driven framework combination. And we have lots of keywords. Those are developed to support the test automation. So in our team, we used to have like 70% manual and 30% automation. Yep. But now we have almost 99% automation testing with the help of this framework, and we moved complete manual testing team to automation testing. So just to give you a little bit idea about the hybrid framework that we have been using, this is just a sample. This is just one of the screenshots from our documentation. So it has a keywords, for example, click, type, those actually performing the actions on your web page. Element is another keyword that helps you to store the locators. You can have another object repository, just store all your object elements in the object repository and load it once instead of declaring one by one. It also supports the variable parameterization, like save. This is a keyword which is used to store some value into a variable. I won't be going through each and every, but just wanted to give you a high level idea. So if you look at here, there is a data keyword which actually loads the data from a CSV file. And the elements, these are just example for how you store an element if you want to, or you can just load that complete CSV file or repository file. And then go to with the URI path. Type, perform typing hello in some text box, save the value of 3.14 into a pi variable and perform some assertion. So this is just a very simple and basic example how the test case will look like. So in order to show you an example, this is the real test case that we have in our project. So I just took 2 snapshots randomly to demonstrate how that test case will look like. it might have a pre-steps. So repo keyword is basically the repository keyword. You can call it as an object repository to load the different locators into a framework. The data keyword is for the data parameterization to my test case. Let's say that CSV file is having 100 rows of data, then the same test will be executed for 100 times if you choose to. And these are just example of keywords. The early page is again one of the standard that we have. So you don't have to actually specify a URL. It might change in future. So we will still use the same keyword even though that URL changes. And that ID value is actually coming from the data sheet. So it does supports the repeat feature, the looping feature, some console printing. It also supports the proxy, reading the HAR for network capturing, and processing the network calls. So these are just examples of a test case. And let's talk about the test management. We are using the TestRail as our test management tool. All these automation tests are stored into TestRail only. So the framework is written in such a way that it can pick up the test cases from the TestRail, execute it, process it. Then again, that result goes back to the TestRail. So any QA, they don't have to really run the framework. They just have to use Jenkins to trigger the automation test. And they can actually view the result in TestRail as well as Jenkins, as well as we have test result dashboard. So in a background, the framework will be triggering the test on a browser stack with a parallel execution mode. I will be going to that in more detail in next few slides. So this snapshot is just an example of one of the test plan that we have. So this is a plan for daybreak testing we are doing. So as you can see, I'm covering here the same type of a test cases for Android with a Samsung S9 device, and the same test cases that will run it on iOS with iPhone XR. These values are configurable. We can have multiple set of a combination. In this snapshot, I just included one for Android and one for iOS. But we can configure that plan easily without any kind of coding. Just go to a TestRail, add whichever suite you want to run, choose the configuration you want to run, and just save it. The next snapshot, it just gives you a detailed information about each run. So test plan is consisting of runs, and each run will have the different test cases. So in this run, you can see this run is configured for Chrome browser with a version as internal latest with Linux as operating system. And this is the environment that I want to use. And to the below here, you will see it's 90% pass with some of the test cases failed. And this is a snapshot. If you click on that failed test case, it will show you the historic execution result for that specific test. So as you can see, it was running on 19th December. I guess December, yeah.
Yep.
But it started failing on 20th. So, it also shows you on which date. That means, you can actually easily find out what was that release, which is actually causing this failure. It also links the report back to the browser stack. So if anybody clicks on the failure result, it actually redirects to a browser stack screenshots, the browser stack session, so that it helps to debug and find out what went wrong. Browser stack also gives the visual screenshots as well as the visual recording of it. So that's pretty helpful. The next part is, as I said, the QA, they just go to a Jenkins, put the test ID or a plan ID or a case ID. There are multiple ways how you can run a test. If a QA wants to, perform a quick smoke test, he can just enter the smoke test ID there, trigger the Jenkins job, and this is the testing pipeline of that job. This pipeline is actually a sub-part of the main deployment pipeline. I will be going through that later on. Todd, would you like to take the next slides?
Yeah, so as you saw in TestRail, we had those configurable devices or browsers that we could put in. We had to work with our analytics group to tell us which are the most popular devices. Here's a screenshot. I actually get this particular chart is in a monthly review that I have with our BrowserStack customers rep, we go over our usage and we go over our error rates each month. And in this one, we like to find out how we're running our tests because, to be honest, our manual testers that you would normally think are manual testers, they're actually test engineers, and they can create their own test plans and test runs and configure them however they want and run them on whatever devices. So it's good to have a screenshot or a review each month to say, hey, what are my people using? When this one jives up with what we've got, I'm really happy about it to see, yes, we got this breadth of coverage. These are just for mobile. I have another one for browsers and another one for tablets as well. But the big thing on this was we had a huge change that really focused us on getting better coverage, getting devices. Because this chart is our device usage over time. As you can tell, back in July of 2016, we were a majority desktop. Mobile was pretty close, but majority of our users were desktop. It's people like, we're weather.com and wonderground.com. So most of the people would come in to work, get on a fast internet connection, bring up weather.com on their computer, on their desktop, and search for the weather and look at videos and things like that. After that, we saw this sharp deviation of mobile users actually getting more. You see that convergence in July? That's actually a hurricane. And hurricanes for us, a lot of people get on at work. They'll bring up videos on their desktops at work because it's a fast internet connection and everything. And you see that we had this desktop users actually just surpass it. But then after that, it started to really deviate. And for here, we saw back in July of 2017, August, that time, that we really had to invest in getting mobile devices and increasing our test coverage in mobile devices. Obviously, we went out and searched through the industry and we looked for various solutions, and we settled on BrowserStack for our use because it fit what the characteristics that we were looking for. So results, once we run all these tests, and I want to make sure I impress upon you, in the tests, they're written by these testers in the squad. We taught them the framework, and they write tests like CSS code, as you saw there, and they are writing those tests and just transferring them over into our regression. So then when we run those, we actually see increase the number of releases, our goal of increasing the number of releases to multiple times per day. We did that because we had to increase the number of releases. We had to increase our test coverage for that. And we also had, once they ran all these tests, we had to quickly understand what our test results were. If you run a lot of tests, especially web front-end tests, you get a lot of failures. You might have caching failures, you might have just general web internet traffic failures, that type of thing. And you have to be able to interpret these tests quickly and be able to make a judgment on when you can go to production. So to do this, we added a smoke test or a deployment pipeline. We adopted test result minimums to give us that clear result so we could have a pass-fail criteria and move on. And then we added comparison charts so that we could see those the results or the success of the test very rapidly. And lastly, we had to add some monitoring for our test usage, our device usage during our test execution, because sometimes we would hold up the number of tests that we could run just because of our volume and kind of adjust when we run tests. So Vikas, why don't you talk a little bit about smoke tests and what we did with that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Todd.
Well, the deployment pipeline, I could talk a little bit about deployment. Maybe I should start there. So this is our deployment pipeline in Jenkins. This is, well, actually this is half of it. There is another half of the build step that we can go in by each application, each release. This one is actually the deploy to cloud. You'll see out there that we have various steps in there, and a lot of them relate to where are we deploying. So we have our first step of deploy to dev. We have a couple in there that are optional, this QA, QAT, and perf. Those are for special projects. We don't always deploy to those, and in this example, they skipped over those. We have stage, which is our pre-prod environment. We have our smoke test, and then we have prod, and you see all these other ones out there, the WX prod 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. Those are production clusters all throughout the world. So this will deploy out a release or a package out to the various environments. So now, why don't you talk about the smoke test, and in that step, after they deploy to stage, they kick off the smoke test, and what are they actually doing?
Sure, thanks, Todd. So as Todd already mentioned, so if there is, so we do have a nightly regression scheduled every day. So, it actually executes thousands of test cases consuming like 4 to 5 hours over a night. And that gives us pretty much good idea every morning in the stand-up that, what is the current health and are we really good for going for release or not. So if release boss is actually doing releases today, he basically goes through the regression report first. And second thing, he might want to go through the smoke test cases because we do quick releases, sometimes 2 or 3 releases in a day also, without going through the complete regression. We just pick up the quick plans that we want to execute, and we actually conclude whether to go for release or not shortly. So this smoke test is basically the completely automated stage in the development pipeline. And when we call as a smoke test, it's actually a visual regression testing. You can call it as a visual comparison testing or a visual regression testing. So what we do here is we consider weather.com, the production site, as a benchmark to our staging environment, and we compare the changes. If there are some mismatches or if something new layout bugs are found. So basically the visual regression gives us the data mismatch kind of issues, the layout mismatch issues, or even let's say page not found, or some page link is not opening or something like that. Those issues are come up directly here. So in this case, you can see that data is not really matching, and it is because of the caching issue. It's not really a bug, but yes, it is something to do with the Akamai server's caching issue. So which is considerably okay, I guess, right?
Well, we have to check it. So yeah. This tells us, yeah, go check that page and make sure it's looking right.
Okay, we added this snapshot purposefully because we wanted to show you how the differences look like. The next screenshot, it's showing me the result minimals. So we have set like 10% allowed tolerance for a visual regression screen matching. So you see a different web pages. And the 10-day page that we have just now seen in the previous slide is having 23.21% failure. And the release boss actually goes through the regressional test, and it's quite easy. It hardly takes 5 or 10 minutes to go through these snapshots. It also gives a confidence that, oh, my all the pages are working fine and there is no major impact on my website. Also, the overnight regression results gives us more confidence that yes, we can go ahead with the release. The next one is the comparison chart. You can also call it as a test result dashboard. It basically gives the test statistics for my historic run also. You can change the date, and you can pick up any plan that ran in a past, and you can fetch the results. It also gives you a trend. Now in this example, you can see the plan that we ran is regression BrowserStack mobile. The second one from the row, it has 97% passing. So we try to have passing percentage above 95 all the time. If it is coming below 95, then there is something, somebody has to really go into the failure and, get those things fixed first. So this is kind of a goal that we have set. And to the right-hand side, you can see a chart. So earlier it was used to be like into 80s. On 16th of Jan, it went to 97, and then suddenly it changed to 92. So these are some of the stages we have to really go into the plan, and we actually validate each and every failure, and whether we decide is it a legitimate bug, or is it something that we have to do with the test cases. But mostly that turns out to be either a bug or some changes in the test cases, or some changes in the element locator or something.
One thing to note on this, the thing that we look a lot at is in that middle row, you see the fail pass, fail fail, fail null, fail untested. When you're dealing with tests, your most important thing is what failed today that passed yesterday. Those are the things that we're after. And you see that underlined, we can click into that and actually drill into those test cases and the results and find out why did it fail today, and try to help the user or the release boss or the tester or whoever that's using this to really drill in to see what the failures are. So great. Yeah.
Thanks, Todd. I almost missed that part.
Yeah.
So yes, as Todd said, just click on the single link, and that shows you the new test cases. Those are failing now, but it was passing yesterday with their failure messages. And if you click on there, it redirects to a test trail, and then from test trail you can redirect to BrowserStack. So we do have that linking here. The next chart you can see here is the Android and iOS percentages. So you can actually decide whether there are more failures on iOS, or or Android is more consistent in that way. So it also gives you the device-wise distribution of the failure. The next thing is a grid monitor, or so BrowserStack is basically a Selenium grid internally, right? So when we run multiple parallel test cases, let's say 70 test cases, generally we run 60 to 70 test cases in a parallel that we run. It becomes very difficult to find out, to see how many free licenses are still there, so that I can trigger a new plan if I want to, do some manual automation testing. Or let's say, you exhausted your license and something went wrong last night, and you want to find out how many tests were in queue and or in running stage. So this dashboard really helps us to find out. It also gives us some details about which devices, the platform, operating system version we are using for automation testing. So this is very helpful for getting some insight with the BrowserStack automation testing. It also helps us to decide when to go ahead and schedule our automation testing overnight, because this gives me an idea, from this time to this time, the Android iPhones are busy, Androids are on iPhone, I can go with the desktop automation testing at that time. So it also helps in planning when to run the test cases overnight or schedule it. I think that's all from my side. Todd, would you like to go ahead?
Cool. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about deployments, because remember our last goal was reduce release failures to less than 5%. To accomplish that, we had to measure our results and encourage all groups the importance of reducing the failures. And this one is more of a kind of how do you socialize your results, and how do you show people what you're doing. So the first thing that we had to do is we publish our deployment results monthly in a product status review. There is a huge meeting where they got all the different players that make up weather.com and wonderground.com, and we get into a monthly review and we talk about all the items with it. In that, I publish out the deployment results, the pass and the failures and things like that. We also, any failure, and failures for us are going to be things like if we had to initiate a rollback or if we had to fix forward. We try to keep it to those things. Anything that goes out and the functionality is not exactly what we expected, and we had to do one of those two things, that constitutes a failure. And we have to go before the change advisory board, which is a centralized group, and explain the failure, explain what happened, the mitigation, and how are we going to correct the issue itself. And then we add, and this is the management part of me, is in everybody's performance review, I added a goal to this item. So we stepped out, we said, hey, you got to have less than 5% failure, and we keep adjusting that goal to for the people in my group, and that's all part of their yearly review, and they take it seriously. They know that it's there, and they do a great job of keeping up with it. So in conclusion, kind of want to review, we worked hard to reduce the number of features in each release. So we got to where we did that by getting the release boss and getting a better handle on our releases, getting better control, better guardrails. We increased our test coverage by adding the hybrid framework, getting more devices out there that we could run our tests against, and then kind of increase our tests and watch what we're doing to increase our test coverage. We reduced our failure rate dramatically by increasing that test coverage, doing those releases and keeping control over them. And then lastly, we hit our stretch goal of increasing the number of releases to multiple times a day. So our new chart going through 2019, you see where we were in 2015 and 16, where the 162 and the 192. We have grown substantially. So now in 2019, we did 1,149 releases last year. For that, you see the number of features. It actually it actually was less than 2018. So we are around the 2.5 mark, 2-point-something mark to do, and we hit our goal of reducing that number of features in each release so we don't have that contention and those things that could cause problems in other areas. And with that, what that did for us is it dramatically changed our failure rate. Back in 2015, we were at a 21% failure rate. I just did their reviews, and we showed up at a 2.13% failure rate. By introducing all these things and socializing what we were doing, we were able to dramatically reduce our failure rate and actually be in a much better place. And to tell you the truth, I get a lot less headaches from my boss, and she becomes very happy when we talk about our release stability than when we were in 2015. So hopefully you got something out of this story, I hope. I want to save a little bit of time now for any questions. I saw some things coming through. So Praveen, I mean, if you want to kind of help me with that. I don't know if you want me to stop sharing now or if you
no, that's fine. You can keep sharing. I will just walk through some of the questions. So I think, thanks first off, Todd, and because I think that's quite impressive, going from 20+% to 2% in terms of failure rates. Quite an amazing accomplishment. So something to aspire to, I think, for all QA and sort of software teams. So Todd, I think a few questions that I think users have asked, attendees have asked. I think the first one is around. In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about what is the release failures and trying to reduce that. I think, what is the definition? How do you define a release failure? Is it when a rollback was required, or is it when production bugs were caused?
Yeah,
whether there was a rollback or not.
Right. Thanks, Praveen. The release failure is actually dictated by the change advisory board. So they have certain criteria that we have to follow. For us, it's the rollback or the fix forward. They have different criteria that we fill in. So we use ServiceNow for change requests, and then we put in the status on there and they control that. But for the most part, you could think of it as either a rollback or a fix forward.
All right, great. Thanks, Todd. I think the next question was around, as you shifted from a few releases a week to multiple releases a day, any tips for how to do that when your team size is small? We have teams, for example, the person who's asked the question has asked about, I think the current release cycle is, monthly. How do they move to a weekly or a multiple releases a day time frame?
Yeah, I think we have to define small because looking at the size of our applications and the number of things that we put out, our team is relatively small. it's organization is the biggest piece. And it gets back to these items that we talked about of controlling your releases, getting your test coverage to cover those things that are most important to you and the biggest pieces of your app. And then working with a DevOps team and come up with a pipeline that is suitable for the release process that you're dealing with, that your people can easily navigate. Then give the results when you do the test, have the results in a fashion where people can easily determine, hey, can this go out the door? It's not quite a red light, green light, but it's pretty close to that.
Okay, great. Just a quick announcement. Some of you, you would have seen a poll come up on your screen. Just if you could take a second to answer that. In the meantime, let's move on to the next question. I think, when you talked about release boss as sort of a role that you created as part of this new process, are you thinking about automating that process maybe potentially and not having a release boss at all going forward?
We actually started that. I forgot to include that in the journey. We automated merging to begin with. And what happened was we were actually deploying things out in a way where they were going one right after another, and our testing would take too long. And I wouldn't say too long, but so you get one thing going through a pipeline and then you do a test step and it's going to take like an hour to do smoke tests and a basic regression. Well, you got another thing right behind it that's got to do the same thing. So what we found was it was a little more economical if the two didn't collide, if you didn't have a merge conflict or anything of that nature, you could put them together and then send it down the road and actually have it done. So at first we did automate merging where it was an automated function as soon as the QA approval, or not QA approved, but the dev approve was done. But what we found was we were kind of running way too many tests and having too much of a cycle. So we wanted to introduce this release boss to kind of corral it a little better, if that makes sense.
Sure. Got it. Okay, moving on. I think there were a couple of questions around the framework. I think Vikas, when you sort of touched upon the framework that you guys had built in-house. So one is the framework open source or proprietary? And second is, any tips or words of advice on how to pick a framework when, let's say, the team is not familiar with any particular one?
Okay. The first question I will answer, it's not a open source tool. It took a lot of considerable effort. We haven't made it open source. It's a closed source framework that we have developed internally. Yeah. And if you are choosing any framework, it basically depends on what type of testing you are doing. With the weather channel, we already scrapped like 2-3 frameworks before this final framework. And then we concluded to go with the hybrid framework. So it actually took, lots of trials and errors to confirm, which is actually the best fit. We also tried BDD. We also tried the data-driven only. We only tried keyword, and then we concluded, okay, let's go ahead and we use hybrid instead of using a BDD or just a single data-driven or a keyword-driven framework.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about that before, and where we came up with this was, I think Ryan and I were on a trip. Ryan Lavelle was a previous member of our team, worked a lot with Vikas, and we went through all those steps and said, okay, we did we had our traditional Selenium, and then we did BDD, and we're like, okay, we got to fix this. There's got to be a different way. And we sat in a bar and kind of drew it out on a napkin kind of thing and said how we wanted to do this. And yeah, it was one of those things. It's just, you get a relaxed state and you kind of figure out. But I will tell you this, if you're implementing a framework, if you're a manager or if you're talking to your manager, they have to be a little strong-willed. You got to be able to hold back and let your folks do the work, because what we found was that hybrid, and to teach the people how to use it and get the training in place. And we knew there was going to be a reward at the end. I just had to keep the barbarians at the gate, if you would, the management, from saying, hey, what are you guys doing, to make sure that we had the time to do that. So it's important to make sure that you have a strong will and that you believe in the system that you're in.
Yeah, I really thank Todd. He provided that opportunity to everybody. He allowed a time for the automation team to come up with the framework development first, and then start with the actual automation testing. So he really did a good investment, and the team is actually getting good returns on that.
Great. Great. I think a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So I think a couple of questions around general automation practices, right? So one is, when do you start automating a new feature, right? So you're releasing, let's say, a brand new feature with a bunch of new user flows and screens. Do you start automating them immediately, or sort of maybe you can talk a little bit about when do you take that call to start automation? And the second is, if you're automating everything, how do you build confidence that your automation is correct? So how do you build that confidence in your automation pipeline or in your automation suite that it is testing the right things and it is working as expected?
We have meetings.
Yeah, we have meetings.
We have meetings.
Yeah, we do. Well, to answer the first one, when do we do automation? We do it right from the get-go. So as design, so it's a squad. It's an agile squad. So design is working with product to come up with, hey, this is the feature that we want. And as they start designing it, developers are going in and they're labeling their elements, and they're kind of getting we use Storybook because we're a React app, and we use Storybook to kind of help map out what we're going to do with this. And then within Storybook, our testers are writing test cases against that because we know how it's going to work. So they really start writing right away. Then back to the second question, how do you know your tests are running well, is we do, before they get thrown into regression, we have a test case review meeting that we go through test cases and we review them. We do peer review on tests, and then we run them. And we run them on various devices, and we run them in initial plans to make sure that they're bulletproof before they get put into a regression. And then we constantly refine them. So things that are in regression, we get a lot of failures. We look for it and said, hey, it failed yesterday. Is this because the test is bad, or is it because we have a missing functionality, or the functionality is wrong? And we'll mark things in repair. And we're constantly keeping up with it. It's code. You have to do it. You have to treat it like code and treat it like any other development project. And it has to be maintained.
Great. Awesome. Great. I think we're almost at the hour now. So thanks a lot again, Todd and Vikas. It was really good to see sort of your journey. I think building Wonderground and weather.com, and taking that from a few releases a week to multiple releases a day, and going from 20+% to 2%. I think that's quite the accomplishment. So thank you for sharing your journey, sharing your insights. And thank you all for joining us on this webinar. We will be sharing a recording of this webinar with you in the next couple of days. And again, we will be sharing or adding this link to our YouTube channel, and watch out for that. And thanks again for attending. Thank you, Todd and Vikas. Have a great day.